afternoon. Why do some parts of the past live on while others disappear? How do cities decide which buildings to preserve and which to tear down, or which people to include in a history textbook and which to omit? These are not random events. Even a house accidentally destroyed in a fire can be rebuilt exactly as it was or in a totally new fashion. Similarly, some volunteer or curator, decides which objects will be put on display in a museum and what the labels about them will say. These decisions about what to keep and remember and what to omit and destroy are not just decisions about the past, but about the present and the future. It's a way for groups to portray themselves and their histories as they want to be seen by others. Such decisions also help envision our future. When a society decides what to remember, it decides what it is. When I was 21, I moved into a homestay in Moscow where I was studying Russian language. There were these big metal plaques on the building's wall, but I didn't recognize any of the names. My grammar teacher, curious, asked me to write them down. When I brought them in, she told me these were very famous men, military men, who also had been victims of the Great Purge. That year, I visited the Gulag Museum, and I saw Jan Gamarnik's name on the wall, just like it was on the plaque on my building. An old Bolshevik, deputy commissar of defense, and the chief of the Red Army's political department, he's also known as one of the first victims of the Great Purges. I still remember how strange it felt, this shock that my little exchange student life had intersected somehow with these great sweeps of violence. How could so many normal lives have ended in such terror and secrecy? Later, I decided to research the memory of Soviet repressions, which brought me to Russia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and finally Kazakhstan, where I have been conducting research on the diverse memorials, museums, and monuments dedicated to victims of Soviet repressions across the country. How did these formerly silenced memories come to be spoken aloud again and inscribed on the landscape anew? Who fought for this and why? And what are the different ways that this memory can be brought back to life? And what are the controversies and painful conversations? So, heritage is not exactly history. If history is the study of what happened in the past, using documents, photographs, and other evidence, heritage is more the story of what people tell themselves and others about their own past, and it's not always necessarily based in fact. Out of everything that has ever happened, why remember certain battles, wars, places, and people while others are forgotten? Who decides and why which stories will be inscribed on stone monuments or put into the history books, while others are only spoken about in whispers or completely forgotten? No story of a nation or a town or an event can include every detail, but what is always included and what's never included tell important things about what a society wants to say about itself, not just about its past, but about its present and future. In many countries, the most beautiful and historic places are classified as national or even world heritage. Think of the Parthenon in Greece, Stonehenge in the United Kingdom, or the Great Wall of China. And these are all supposed to be places that the whole world can agree are important and worth preserving for the future. But why would anyone want to preserve a site of mass violence instead of tearing it down and forgetting about it? Why, in the 21st century, do people make museums out of former concentration camps and labor camps, or put markers on the buildings of former secret police headquarters, or even build new monuments on top of a mass grave? And why would anyone want to visit a place like that? And why bother anyway when there are history books? Let's explore this through looking at the Gulag heritage sites in Kazakhstan and why it's important to preserve them for the world. So, why is it important to preserve Gulag heritage? There are three main reasons. First, the landscapes and the sites themselves preserve evidence that was never photographed or written down. So for example, I might know that a certain person was in a specific camp for a certain number of years, But if I know they're in Karlog was the size of Switzerland, and the documents aren't always very detailed. So often, researchers don't know exactly where a specific person was, where they were living, and what they were doing. But in my research, I was lucky to meet Catherine Erdman and Gavin Slade, who excavate on the steppe looking for traces of inmates making mud bricks under the hot sun, and also asking people who still live in the area what they remember. And so through this, researchers find traces of the inmates' lives, like a broken piece of glass, bumps on the ground exactly where the barracks used to be, a name scratched into a cell wall. We might never know exactly who was there, which person it was, but through these traces we can connect, if only for a moment, and understand that there was a real person here, standing in the exact same place. Looking at these traces, one can feel a shock like the one I felt in Moscow so many years ago. A spark of connection, a person seeing another, just briefly, through space and time. And these traces are also evidence of how the camp worked while it was in operation and what it may have looked like, filling in archival gaps and proving that the Gulag was right here, full of living, breathing people. But Gulag sites are also places where people can remember the suffering caused by Soviet repression. Many people and families remember their painful histories, and many towns and cities in Kazakhstan have memorials dedicated to the people lost to the Gulag, to state-sponsored famine, or to mass shootings. But there can be a special resonance that can occur when someone travels to a site where the violence really directly happened. It can be painful to revisit a site like the Spassk Cemetery near Karlog, where dozens of nations have set up memorials, not just to the at least 7,000 people buried there, but symbolically to all of their people who suffered and died in Karlog. Being able to lay a wreath or a flower or a candle at the place where the violence really happens can help one access painful emotions and also bring the past alive so they feel physically and mentally close in a way no history book itself can provide. This year at Algiers on May 30, I spoke to people who had traveled there from across Kazakhstan and from abroad to lay flowers and wreaths and to gather to remember both personal and societal losses. At ceremonies like this, some people feel that they're able to cry for the first time, and others are inspired to act to change their worlds. At this ceremony this year, multiple people, finding out that I'm a foreign researcher, generously shared histories of their families' repressions with me because they really wanted me to understand what had really happened and how much the Soviet era had hidden. And for me, this is really almost a sacred experience when a stranger decides to share their private and difficult memories with me. But beyond emotion, these experiences of remembering and mourning also bring a past that was silenced by authoritarianism back into the light, which means that these ceremonies aren't just about grieving and remembering, but they're embodied and collective acts of protest and commemoration. Finally, preserving these sites helps us to educate people about what really happens and how, in the hopes of ensuring it never happens again. So we've already talked about how protecting these sites helps us to find out more about exactly what happened and where, which fills in the gaps in archival research. But this evidence has another purpose. By showing the visitors exactly how big a camp was, how many people passed through the area, traces of their lives and their eventual fates, the reality of mass terror and repression makes itself known. Confronted with tangible evidence of this past terror, walking in the same places where shoeless inmates were forced to work hard manual jobs in the freezing cold, the past almost comes alive in the visitors' bodies. At Janalik, a mass grave of people murdered by the NKVD outside Almaty, there's a museum on site that discusses the Great Terrors, mass shootings, and other aspects of Soviet repression, alongside a memorial wall that has the names of people buried on site. However, the third room focuses instead on the present and future, on this grassroots group that fought to figure out who the victims were, the truth about them, how they were killed and why, and then they fought to have the memorial built. So by preserving these memories through historical and archaeological research, memory work, and ceremonies, they also work towards a future free of mass violence and mass incarceration, educating people about the past to build a better future. Sharing facts, memories, and stories about the Gulag in Kazakhstan and preserving Gulag heritage has more benefits. First, it helps people learn about hidden histories of violence and its legacies, which can invite people to think critically about the past and its uses in all sorts of situations. But it also invites the visitor to make connections between this and other instances of Soviet repressions in other times and places, which can lead people to reflect on repression's many faces and consequences. Finally, this memory work brings the past to life so people can not just read, but feel how injustice and repression can happen. Yet this experience can also show people how to avoid letting society slip into repression anew and why it's so important to keep it at bay. In this way, history, archaeology, memory, and heritage come together to paint a fuller picture of the past, full of emotions, embodied experiences, and real people. Galia Itiatova's documentary film beautifully weaves these threads of knowledge together, showing how alive these memories are and why these sites are so valuable, not just for national, but for global prosperity. I never forgot the strange shock I felt when I saw Gamarnik's name on a list of Great Terror victims, just as I had seen his name, but not really remarked on it, on an unremarkable plaque on an old building every day. Sometimes, in my research in Kazakhstan, I feel that same shock of recognition again. A pair of eyeglasses from the mass grave in Janalik, a letter from a child in a Gulag orphanage to his mother, a towel embroidered with human hair. On the landscape, an unremarkable-looking building turns out to have a violent past as an NKVD prison, while an unassuming stretch of trees turns out to hide a mass grave. Although memory of past suffering can be mobilized to foment contemporary violence, it can also serve as a warning for the present and the future, mobilized to ensure a free and peaceful world. In choosing what to remember and what to forget, societies choose paths that tend towards violence or peace. Kazakhstan's Gulag heritage, therefore, also holds lessons for global society, reminding us what is at stake through history and memory. Thank you. Rahmet. Spasiba.